Dog Works Radio is sponsored by Alaska Dog Works. Check out their website at alaskadogworks.com. You can support this podcast on patreon.com/Teamaneke.
This episode of the podcast is brought to you by First Paw Coffee Company, specializing in private label premium blend coffee. If you're serious about coffee, you should check it out. First Paw Coffee's passion is high-quality, small-batch roasted coffee. They take the extra time to taste and get everything perfect before they release new blends. They aim to bring you a cup of happiness each time you pour yourself some coffee. Find out more at ak.dog/free and enter for a chance to win some First Paw Coffee prizes, a book from our collection, and tote bag. One winner will be selected at random each month. That's ak.dog/free.
Radio Free Palmer 89.5 KVRF presents Mushing Radio, hosted by Robert Forto. Mushing Radio is about dog-powered sports, living in the Great White North, and mushing. Visit our website at mushingradio.com. Here is your host, Robert Forto.
Hello and welcome, everybody. This is Robert Forto, and you're listening to our Iditarod coverage here on Mushing Radio. You can find all of our episodes over on dogworksradio.com. Be sure to follow us on social media by searching Dogworks Radio, and you can also find us on the radio dial at 87.9 in the Matsu Valley. If people still listen to radios in their car, I assume they do. And I am joined by my co-host Alex Stein from California. Alex, how's it going?
It's going very well, Robert. We live in interesting times, don't we?
We sure do. I'm watching the movie Legally Blonde this evening, so if that says anything at all, it is definitely a different world since last week.
Yeah, and for those of you who may not know this, Robert is not a strong rom-com guy. You're a sports guy.
I am a sports guy, yes.
So over on the Iditarod Trail, last night we had 11 teams at Elam, and some people in the press and on Twitter started calling them the Elam 11. As people may remember, they were stuck in Elam. There was a gigantic storm, and yesterday they tried to go ahead to White Mountain. They made it probably about 10 miles outside of Elam, and couldn't really find the trail. They have been sort of detoured onto an overland trail, an old mail trail, because the ice at Golovin Bay or Golovin Lagoon, I'm not sure which is the right name, was very thin, and it wasn't safe to go across. So they changed it and had them go around, but the storm was so bad that they couldn't find the trail, and even the trail breakers who were out there couldn't find the trail either. So after about 10 miles, they decided we're going to go back to Elam and, be where we're sheltered and wait out the storm and then try this again. And then this morning they all went out at about 5:30 in the morning. The trail breakers went out a little bit before that. And for the first, I would say probably for the first 15, 20 miles, they were traveling like in a very tight caravan. And the distance between the first one, who most of the time was Martin Boozer, who was sort of leading the way and breaking trail, the distance between him and the 11th team was often just a little bit over a mile. And that's pretty tight for 11 dog teams, isn't it?
It is, for sure. And what's even more interesting is that's not a route that has been used very often for many years. It's my understanding that Martin's only been on it one time, and that's when he got lost many, many years ago.
Right. And, it needless to say was not very well marked. It's not a trail that anyone, I think, was at all familiar with. And the reports were that it had not been used basically for this entire winter. So So that's kind of a difficult situation to be in. The other thing about traveling that close with so many teams is that you can't really, especially in this type of new snow that's not really packed down and is very is very deep and you'll just sink down into it. You can't really pass anyone. And so as a result, you're all kind of going at the same speed, and they were going fairly slowly, at least at first. And basically, if one team is stopping, then every team behind them is stopping. But on the other hand, it in a case like this is a really good thing because it made sure that they were all traveling together. No one was left behind. And if anything happened to any of them, there were 10 other teams to help them out, plus snow machiners. And at some points, the trail was so bad that they were catching up to the snow machiners and would have to sort of stop and wait for the snow machiners to go a little bit further. So it was a long, long day for them. And I am happy to announce that they are all in Elam right now.
White Mountain.
White Mountain. And they came in between 147 was Grayson Bruton, and the last one came in at 345.
So about 2 hours separating them, and then they have to take that mandatory 8-hour rest. So not only did they stay a day and a half, almost 2 days in Elam, but then they have to turn around and rest for 8 hours. I bet you that really messed with the dogs' minds a little bit.
Yeah, we heard some reports that some of the dogs, when they were in Elam, were getting a little bit bored and were sort of, they're sled dogs. They want to run, so they were confused about why they were hanging out instead of running. But we had talked a little bit over the past few days about what would happen if they were to call the race, and not only were dealing with 11 mushers and 11 sleds and all of that equipment, but also, and I counted up before we went on the air, and it's something like 110 or 115 dogs. So it would be really difficult to get all of those people evacuated.
And right before we aired, I read an article, or excuse me, a post on Facebook by Martin's wife, Kathy. And one thing that she said that we should mention here is they're all going to run the rest of the race as if it is a race. They're no longer going to travel as a pack. They're going to leave at their appropriate times and make their way to Nome on their own. I think that's a great decision, don't you?
Yeah, it's a great decision because apparently the trail is in much better shape than it was yesterday and the day before, when those three teams who headed out and had to be evacuated by helicopter got stuck before safety. So I saw someone posted on Facebook a video from Nome, sort of walking around the town and talking about the trail conditions and the weather. And it looks like, even though it was very warm a couple days ago, it's going to the temperature is going to go down tonight. So we're going to have people starting to travel at like close to 10 o'clock at night, and a couple hours later the last one will leave. And I think that they're going to have fairly good weather coming into Nome for those last 77 miles.
And they said that the trail is very well marked. You had mentioned that during that trip from Elam to White Mountain, they didn't have very many markers. And of course, that's probably because of just the work of trying to get that trail in on a trail that has no base. So I can only imagine how difficult that was for the trail breakers, and to make sure that was possible. So we should see these guys into Nome. You said that most of them are leaving sometime around 10 o'clock on tonight, so they should be in Nome sometime in the afternoon tomorrow if everything goes well. What I did see before we go into our next story, Alex, that there was a video or a picture on Facebook that they were already rolling up the finish line. They were wrapping up the fencing and all of that. Seems a little premature. What are your thoughts on that?
They sometimes do that, especially when it's windy. They take down all of the banners, um, and so it. While it does seem premature, there's nothing about this race and this year that's been really normal. So yeah, I'm not really sure what to say about that.
So let's move on over to an update about the three teams that were rescued by the National Guard helicopter a couple of days ago. What do you have on that?
Yeah. So Tom Nolmeyer, Sean Underwood, and Matt Failer were all rescued outside of safety. They had not yet gotten to safety. They all hit their SOS things, and they were rescued by the Alaska Army National Guard's 1st Battalion. When the Guard got there, they were all inside of their sleeping bags, and the medics got them into the helicopter and warmed up and gave them oxygen. And they were apparently relatively okay, but they had run into some real overflow and just were not able to continue. And then after that happened, they brought 3 dog handlers to come and mush their teams the rest of the way into Nome, which was probably only about 30 miles. But it was where they were, it was easier to get fresh drivers to basically take the dog teams in than to put the dogs on a helicopter or land a small plane and get the dogs on a small plane. So those 3 teams, the dogs are all in Nome now. The dogs are all doing well, and the mushers are all doing well as well.
That's a really interesting story. I wonder who those dog mushers were, or the handlers were. And I want to add a little bit of the Serum Run expedition story here. For those that you don't know, right outside of Galena, one of our dog mushers, Kirsten Bay, was hit by a snow machiner. It was at about 9 or 10 o'clock at night, and it was a tragic accident. But anyway, they launched a rescue party to go out and get her, and scooped her up and took her to the clinic in Galena. But there, she was still out there without somebody to drive the dogs in. And one of the local folks from the village said he would do it, and he jumped on the sled and rode it into Galena. And I was there when he pulled into the community center, and I thought for sure it was one of the guys from our expedition, and I was calling him his name and everything. And then he pulled up, and I said, well, this isn't Cody, is the guy I was thinking of. It was another guy. And I said, hey, what's going on? He said, hey, what's up? He goes, I haven't been on a dog sled in 30 years. And he did great. He rode him in. It was about a 6 or 7 mile run, but he jumped on the sled when he had to. And it's like riding a bike, I guess. That's sort of the moral of the story. He jumped on that sled and rode him in like he was an expert at it.
Yeah, I was going to ask you if you thought it was like riding a bike. You just have the muscle memory of how to do it.
Yeah. It's just one of those things for sure. But I just thought that was a cool story when you said that about the handlers. But those folks, the 3 of them, I get, as you mentioned, they ended up going to the clinic or the hospital there in Nome. Was it a hypothermia situation, or was it just preventative checks?
I think it was I think hypothermia was starting to set in, so they wanted to make sure that everyone was okay. Matt Failer had posted that they were going through fairly deep overflow for about 2 hours.
Wow.
And they just got to the point where they were basically too cold to continue. And that's when they all decided to hit the button. And they are now officially scratched from the race because, of course, when you hit that SOS button, your race is over.
I've been there and done that as far away as the Yukon River, and as close as away as one of the lakes here in our backyard. And it's never a fun thing. And almost always the dogs do very well. They can pretty much almost swim out of it, like dogs do, or they try to avoid it at all cost. I saw a lot of those pictures of folks coming up off the ice into Nome. I saw Lance Mackey and a few others, and there was a pretty deep section of overflow there, and you can see how a musher gets through that. They'll get off the sled and then wade through that water themselves and pull the dogs through, and then pull that very heavy sled through, and then sort of let the dogs run on, and then they jump on the sled, catch that sled as it's going by, and then head out of that overflow. And then, of course, those guys were heading up to the finish.
Yeah, and even though a lot of the gear is waterproof or water resistant, when you're just going through that much water, I think it's kind of inevitable that some of it will get inside, that some of it will like find a little crevice or a little place where you're not totally wound up and bound up, and will get in there, and that can cause really serious consequences.
And not only that, it's absolutely miserable because everything freezes solid, and there you are, like walking around like Frankenstein, and you're trying to maneuver a sled and work with your dogs, and you're just literally a block of ice from however deep it was down, and it really causes some real discomfort and immovability for sure. So speaking of scratched mushers, you have a story or an update about Nick Pettit. What is about that?
Yeah, so Nick had also been rescued. He was rumored to be scratching early on in the race, and then was encouraged to think about it overnight and decided to keep going. He then right around where a lot of the Elam 11 were, ran into some overflow again, and ran into some bad weather, and decided to scratch. And he also activated his button, and a search and rescue team came and got him, and I believe brought him back to Elam. And after being there for a while, he decided that even though he is not in the race anymore, that he was going to continue and mush his dogs into Nome. So he then did that. He got to White Mountain, I think around noon today, and he had all of his dogs looked at by one of the vets there, and all of his dogs were cleared. There were a couple of dogs that were having some issues, but they seem to have recovered and are doing fine. So he is also planning sometime between now and tomorrow. I'm not sure exactly what his timing or his plans are. He is going to bring his dogs those last 77 miles into Nome. And of course, he's already scratched, so he's not going to get anything for it, but he is going to get the satisfaction of being able to bring his dog team all the way to Nome.
And I thought he would probably do something like that when we found out that he was still there, and the vets had cleared all of his dogs and said everything was okay. And it's definitely a pride thing for sure. And of course, I'm just speaking of opinion, but why not? If you have the supplies and you're that close and your dogs are ready, you might as well finish. And as we were saying off air, it's sort of the opposite of Jeremy Keller, who turned around 200 miles or so into the race and mushed all the way home.
Yeah. And, Nick has had a bit of a difficult race. And so even though he is technically out of the race and isn't competing for anything at this point, it just seems like a real testament to him that he wants to take his dogs all the way into Nome.
So another story broke today, and you have not read about it yet, but we were talking about it right before airtime, and that was about Mitch Seavey announced that he was going to retire. It looks like that Danny Seavey, his son, posted on social media today that Mitch had made his intentions known before the race, that this was his last race, and he was going to tie up all loose affairs and offer Dallas the first pick of his dogs and all of that. And as our listeners know, he came in second this year, and he had a very good race, and we've talked a lot about him on the coverage this year. But what do you think about that? Him retiring with a race that was so close.
It reminds me of when Jeff King retired a few years ago, and then after a year not running Iditarod, he came back. Obviously whatever Mitch wants to do, Mitch can do, but um, it does seem strange to me that he would be so close this year. And really, this is someone who is pretty much at the top of his game and has been for the last, I would say, easily 5 or 6 or 7 years. Um, so it does seem a little bit strange to me that he would go out this year. But on the other hand, people always talk about wanting to go out on top. So, uh, I'm not quite sure what to say about it. Um, he certainly has been an incredible force, especially in the past few years.
We talk about comparisons to other sports, and when I read that, I was thinking about Brett Favre in the NFL, Michael Jordan in the NBA, and scores of Major League Baseball players who say that they're going to retire. I think it's even bigger in sports like boxing when you think about Floyd Mayweather and folks like that. So we will see if this is permanent, but I wouldn't count him out. He may be back in a couple of years, as you say.
Yeah, and definitely the Seavies are an amazing, storied, great mushing family, pretty much a dynasty at this point. So, it'll be very interesting, but whatever he does, I think every mushing fan wishes him the best.
Excellent. So let's go to our musher profile of the evening. We have a good one, don't we?
Yeah, so we have mostly been concentrating on newer mushers and lesser known mushers this year, but our musher of the day today is someone that almost everybody who is followed Iditarod more than casually knows, and that is Martin Boozer. Martin is running in his 37th Iditarod this year, and he is a 4-time winner. He has 19 top 10 finishes, and one of the more amazing things about him is that he has never scratched. He has finished every Iditarod that he has entered. He's won multiple awards, including Most Inspirational Musher in 2005. He's won a bunch of humanitarian awards. He's won dog care awards. He is one of the old guard and one of the people that when you think about who really personifies mushing and who really stands for the things that are the best parts of mushing and the best parts of Iditarod. And I would certainly think that he would be way up there on that list. And especially now that Didi Genreau has retired, I can't think of anyone who is quite in that same level as being, such a dominant figure and such a respected member of the old guard. Martin was born in Switzerland and became fascinated with sled dogs when he was in his teens, moved to Alaska in 1979, and started working with mushers Earl and Natalie Norris. He ran his first Iditarod a year later in 1980. And in 1982, he started his own kennel called Happy Trails Kennel. And the purpose of this kennel was to raise and train happy, fast, long-distance dogs. And when he started, he said that that was his first goal, and his second goal was that he wanted to run the Iditarod and win it. And the kennel began with a Yukon River Village dog and a German short-haired pointer. And at first, he had dogs from other mushers like Gareth Wright and George Atla, and he believed that these sprint dogs that were so popular with these mushers could be trained to do long-distance races. Martin teamed up with sprint musher Jim Welch, and Martin handled for Jim in sprint races, and they developed a relationship and a sort of philosophy for how to breed and train dogs. Um, Jim was working full time, so he and Martin would spend their time that they had raising and training their puppies. And Martin had dogs from both of them and ended up raising and training the puppies for both of them together. Jim wanted dogs that were really fast, and Martin was looking for dogs who were athletic and fast, but not necessarily the absolute fastest. And as their kennels grew and as Martin started doing better and better in Iditarod, Jim got diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, which prematurely ended his racing career. Uh, Martin has Martin won the Iditarod in 2002 with a record time that stood for 9 years, and that is a tremendous amount of time for a record in Iditarod to last. And the other thing is that at the time, the restart was in Wasilla, not in Willow. So that was a record that was run on a trail that was about 80 miles longer than the current trail. Um, Martin has two sons named Nikolai and Roan, both named after Iditarod checkpoints, and they've both been involved with dogs and with the Iditarod. Roan has run 3 Iditarods, the first one in 2008 when he was a senior in high school. And Martin runs the race each year to train and test his dogs and keep his kennel going. He was one of the founders of Mush with Pride, and he makes it a point to take a lot of rookies under his wing and sort of tell them about best practices that he's learned over all these years in running dogs. And I believe when the rookies come up for Iditarod for the rookie meeting, part of that is held at Martin's Kennel, where they get like a lot of hands-on stuff about the Iditarod and about working with dogs. He had been he had not had U.S. citizenship for a very long time, was a permanent resident of the U.S., but still was a Swiss citizen. And after the events of 9/11, he decided that he wanted to become a citizen, and he thought that the United States has been his home for a very long time and wanted to make that official and wanted everybody to know. So he went through all of the steps required to get citizenship and then was sworn in as a new United States citizen when he crossed under the Burled Arch at the end of the Iditarod in 2002, which, by the way, was a race that he won. He has the most consecutive Iditarod finishes in history. He wrote a great book in 2015 called Dog Man. He's sort of known for having a bit of a wry sense of humor and being a bit of a joker. When they were starting out, they had a test program where they gave GPS trackers to just a few mushers, which I believe was in either 2008 or 2009. And Martin was one of the mushers who had a GPS tracker, and he decided that it would be fun to give his tracker to one of the Iditarod Air Force pilots. So suddenly people who were watching these 4 or 5 trackers that were out on the trail saw Martin Boozer seeming to be going like 150 miles per hour. And this year he decided, and we've talked about this a little bit before, that he was going to drive his puppy team and give Tim Pappas a chance to drive his A team. And when the Elam 11 set out this morning, he was leading them. He was the guy who knew what to do in order to get them on this unfamiliar trail up to White Mountain safely. And he is even though he is not going to finish in the money and he is going to finish relatively far back in the race this year, he really, I think, personifies everything you want about the spirit of Iditarod. And as we've mentioned a few times, um, he was the dog advisor and the musher double for William Dafoe as Leonard Seppala in the movie Togo, which is on the Disney Plus streaming channel. And it is really kind of wonderful and perhaps a little bit ironic that he is the guy who was literally leading this team, leading this group of mushers and this group of 100 and something dogs into White Mountain when there was overflow and they couldn't safely pass through the sea ice.
You know, I love these stories, and I've said this many times. I never know who we're going to talk about until we get ready to record for the evening. So it's always a surprise to me. And I always read through the bio on Iditarod.com as you're going through your story. And, you know, most of these guys have a paragraph or two and they thank their sponsors and all that. This guy has an entire page of a bio, and that just shows how long he's been involved with this race and all of the awards and all of the accomplishments that he has. This is one of the old guard that we've talked a lot about in the last couple of years, but I don't see him retiring anytime soon. What are your thoughts?
I don't either, but I do see him perhaps stepping back from really being a competitive force. But I think his kennel is still going to be very competitive. And I think that he's going to be someone who's going to be around for a while. And I'm really happy about that. I've only met him a couple of times, but I had a chance to have a brief but really great conversation with him in 2011 before the start of the race. And literally the first thing I said to him was, thank you for all that you've done for the sport and all that you've done for this race, because it's just an enormous thing. And he continues to do this and to contribute in ways that I'm not sure casual fans are even necessarily aware of, but I think it makes a huge difference to the sport. And I am reasonably sure that it makes a very big difference to a lot of the younger mushers as well.
Am I remembering correctly that not too long ago he was also contemplating running for governor up here in the state of Alaska?
Oh, I didn't hear that, but I can imagine if he did run for governor, he would get a lot of votes.
I seem to remember that. It was several terms ago, pretty much about the time I moved up here. I remember hearing about that, and like you said, I think he would be one of the favorites in terms of the popular vote up here in Alaska. And I don't know anything about his political aspirations, but I think that would be really interesting to have him hold political office, whether it be governor or city council or whatever. He is very, very well known here in the Matsu Valley, and he lives in Big Lake, about, 15 or 20 miles from here, and very popular kennel, especially in the summertime, with folks coming and going and visiting his dogs and all of that. So I'm glad that we were able to have him profiled on the show here tonight. And folks, we have one more episode left on our coverage of the 2020 Iditarod. I am looking very forward to that. And as we mentioned last night, it's typically the show that we do our recap and tell our favorite stories of the race this year. And I'm really looking forward to seeing who our last musher profile of the year will be. And I'm sure you will pick a good one. Alex, anything else before we hang it up for tonight?
Yeah, this is not something that is a huge concern. And certainly as long as there are still mushers on the trail, this is something that should take a back seat. But I was wondering this afternoon what they are going to do. I know the banquet has been canceled, and usually the day before or a couple days before the banquet, there's a big musher meeting. in Nome, and it's a mandatory meeting, and it's closed to the public. And my understanding of it is that there's usually a pretty freewheeling conversation about the race that's just happened and things that went right and things that went wrong. But more importantly, perhaps, that is the meeting where they vote on some of these awards. The most inspirational musher award, and I think they vote on the Golden Stethoscope Award and a few other awards. And I'm wondering what is going to happen with those awards. I mean, I assume that they will be awarded at some point, even if it's not at the banquet. But with all of the mushers sort of dispersed, I'm not quite sure how that happens. And every year, it's one of the things that I love about the end of Iditarod is just seeing who these awards go to. So we're pretty definitely not going to know that by tomorrow. But I hope that whenever we do know that, and however they do, handle this musher meeting, if it's online or on Skype or something, I really would look forward to hearing some of those stories about the people who win these awards.
Yeah, and we've said over and over during our coverage, this is a different time than typical. And our local university, the University of Alaska Anchorage, is planning on holding their commencement graduation ceremonies online without folks being there. I don't know exactly how that could work, where you have 3,000 people getting diplomas and they're all sitting in their homes. So I think it will be interesting to see not only how that goes, but something very similar to how Iditarod can do something like that online as well. People are coming up with all sorts of creative ways to deal with this new normal that we're facing, for sure. So we'll see. And if there is something great in terms of stories, we will jump back on the air in the coming days and talk about it. Otherwise, we will be back here tomorrow night. And on behalf of my co-host, Alex Stein, this is Robert Forto for Mushing Radio. We will see you guys next time. Goodbye.
This episode of the podcast is sponsored by First Paw Coffee Company. Learn more at firstpaw.coffee.
From Dogworks Radio, this is Mushing Radio. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and we invite you to subscribe in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. You'll find a link on the episode notes. You can tap or swipe on the episode cover art, and you'll see some offers from our sponsors. You can support our show by supporting them. If you like what you have heard, we would love it if you could give us a 5-star rating and tell your friends how to subscribe too. Your hosts are Alex Stein and Robert Forto. Our producer is Robert Forto, created for Dogworks Radio. Did you know that Alaska Dogworks trains service dogs for those in need throughout North America? Each and every service dog that is trained through the Lead Dog Service Dog Program and Michelle Forto and her team has an individual training plan. We train for autistic, mobility, psychiatric, and PTSD for our soldiers for service work. If you know of someone that may need a service dog, please take a moment and check out Alaska Dogworks on social media and at alaskadogworks.com.